An hour before you get anywhere near the aircraft, you are sitting in a reclining chair in a quiet room breathing pure oxygen through a mask, and you are not allowed to take it off, not to talk properly, not to drink. You sit there and you breathe, and the reason is that there is nitrogen dissolved in your blood right now, the same as there is in mine, and if you carry it up to where you are going today, it will come out of solution inside your body. So you sit and you breathe it out. Then they seal you into a suit you cannot open, and for the next 12 hours you will not be able to touch your own face. The two highest-rated comments on the biggest video ever made about this kind of duty were both written by men who had done it, and both said the same thing. The part nobody films is the mental load, and nobody puts it in videos for the public. This one is about that part. Here is what happens today. First, the getting ready, which is longer and stranger than the flying and tells you everything about what the altitude actually does to a person. Then, the flight itself, 9 hours alone in a cockpit where the aircraft can only be flown inside a window a few knots wide, and where at hour 6 your shoulder starts to ache and you have no way of knowing what that means. And then the landing, which is the part every pilot who has done it says is the hardest, and then a piece of medical research from a few years ago that changed how high the cockpit is allowed to be. Quick note before we start, no single flight exactly like this one is on the record. Every element in it is documented, the procedures, the suit, the physiology, the research, the numbers. What I have done is put one mission's worth of that end to end. Subscribe because this channel opens up the machines nobody is allowed to enter. And it starts in that chair with the mask because the pre-breathe is the whole problem in miniature. You have nitrogen in your tissues. About 78% of the air you have been breathing your entire life is nitrogen, and a certain amount of it is dissolved in your blood and your fat and your joints at all times. At sea level, that is completely unremarkable. It stays dissolved because there is 14.5 pounds per square inch of atmosphere pressing on you and keeping it there. Take the pressure away and it does not stay dissolved. It comes out as gas, in your joints, in your bloodstream, in your spinal fluid. The same physics as a bottle of fizzy water when you unscrew the cap. Divers know this problem from the other direction and call it the bends. It does not care which direction you approach it from. It only cares about the pressure differential and how fast you cross it. So before you go up, you get the nitrogen out. You breathe pure oxygen for a substantial period, historically about an hour, and later in the program's life considerably longer. And with every breath, the nitrogen coming out of your tissues is replaced with oxygen, which your body can actually use. It is a wash cycle for your bloodstream, and it is the single least glamorous and most important hour of the day. And while you sit there, you are being suited, because the suit takes time and it takes other people. You do not put it on. A team puts it on you. Layers, boots, gloves locked at the wrists, the neck ring, and then the helmet. And the helmet is where it stops being clothing. Because that suit is not clothing at all. It is a pressure vessel that happens to be shaped like a person. Its job is to hold an atmosphere around your body when there is effectively nothing outside it, and everything about it follows from that single requirement. It has to be sealed, so nothing on it opens. It has to hold pressure, so it wants to inflate into a rigid shape, and every joint in it is a piece of engineering designed to let you bend against that pressure, rather than being locked out straight. Wearing it inflated is work. Your hands get tired. Everything is harder than it should be, all day. Then they lock the helmet, and the count starts. From this moment, you cannot touch your face. You cannot rub your eye. You cannot scratch your nose. You cannot wipe sweat. You cannot push your hair out of the way. There is a small port in the helmet through which food can be pushed, as a paste through a tube. That is your access to your own head for the next 12 hours, and every pilot who has flown this aircraft mentions the same thing, which is that the itch you cannot reach becomes a genuine operational consideration and not a joke. And notice who is doing all of this. You are not dressing yourself. A specialist team is sealing you into a garment, checking every seal, pressurizing it and watching a gauge while you sit there with your arms out. They will do the same in reverse in 12 hours. Between those two moments, you are, in a very literal sense, in a container that other people closed and only other people will open. That dependency is designed in, and it is not an inconvenience. A seal you can undo yourself is a seal that can be undone by accident at 70,000 feet, by a person whose judgment is degraded by the very environment the seal exists to keep out. So the suit is not built to be self-serviceable, and the price of that decision is that from helmet lock to helmet unlock, you are not in charge of your own equipment. You do not walk to the aircraft. You are driven in a van carrying a portable air supply because you are already sealed and you are already on suit air. And that van ride is the last time today anyone will be within reach of you. Strapped in, hooked up to the aircraft's systems, canopy down, and now look at what is actually holding you. Not the aircraft. The aircraft is a very light airframe with enormous wings and a small amount of structure. The suit. Around it, a cockpit pressurized to a cabin altitude that for most of this aircraft's history sat somewhere near 29,000 feet, which is roughly the summit of Everest. That is what the inside of the cockpit felt like on a normal day. The suit is not a backup to the cockpit. The suit is the reason the cockpit can be that thin. Then you climb. And this aircraft climbs like almost nothing else because it was built to get above everything, and within a relatively short time you are passing 60,000 feet. Somewhere around 62 or 63,000 feet, you cross a line that has a name, and it is worth knowing what it is. It is called the Armstrong Limit, and it is the altitude at which the ambient pressure drops low enough that water boils at normal human body temperature. Not warm water, not hot water. Water at 37 degrees, which means that above that line, exposed to the outside air, the moisture on your eyes and in your mouth and in your lungs would begin to turn to vapor. Not because it is cold, though it is brutally cold, because there is not enough pressure to keep a liquid a liquid. Your blood is inside a closed circulatory system, so it is more complicated than the phrase people use, but the direction is right and the outcome is fast. You are going about 8,000 feet above that line, and you will stay there for 9 hours. So the suit is not equipment in the sense that a jacket is equipment. Below the Armstrong limit, an oxygen mask can keep you alive because there is still enough pressure outside to keep your body working, and all you are short of is oxygen. Above it, there is no mask solution. There is no amount of oxygen you can breathe that fixes an absence of pressure. The only answer is to carry a pressurized volume with you, and the suit is that volume. At altitude, the aircraft settles into cruise, and this is where the flying itself becomes strange. Up here, the air is so thin that the wing needs a high true airspeed to generate lift at all, so your stalling speed has climbed. And at the same time, you are close enough to the speed of sound in that thin, cold air that going faster starts to cause compressibility problems on the wing, so your maximum speed has come down. Those two numbers have been closing on each other all the way up. At altitude, the gap between them is not large. Depending on weight, temperature, and how high you are, the usable band can come down to something on the order of a few knots. Pilots call it Coffin Corner, and the name is unkind, but the geometry is real. Too slow, the wing stops flying. Too fast, the wing stops behaving. And the corridor between those two outcomes is narrower than the speed variation you would get from flying through slightly different air, which means the autopilot is doing a great deal of work, and you are watching it do that work for 9 hours in a suit you cannot open, in a cockpit the size of a phone box, alone. And then there is what is out of the window, which is the one part of this job that everybody who has done it describes in almost the same words. At 70,000 feet, the sky above you is not blue. It is dark and getting darker toward the top of the canopy because most of the atmosphere that scatters sunlight into blue is now underneath you. Below the aircraft, the horizon is not a line. It is a visible curve, distinctly bent, going away in both directions. 90-something% of the atmosphere is beneath your wings, and you can see where it ends. Pilots who have flown both have said this is the closest a person gets to being in space without leaving the atmosphere, and there is a specific quality to it that comes up again and again in their accounts, that you are looking at something almost nobody sees, from inside a suit, alone, and there is no one to turn to and point, and then you have 8.5 hours left. That is the shape of it. A view that a handful of people in history have had, and then the rest of a working day. You are not sightseeing. You have a route, a schedule, equipment to run, position reports to make, fuel to manage, and an autopilot to supervise inside that narrow speed band. The view becomes the wallpaper of a very long shift, which is a stranger thing to get used to than the altitude. And this is where the job stops being about the aeroplane. 9 hours is not a flight. It is a shift. You have a route to fly and equipment to operate and a schedule to keep, and you have all of it while wearing a rigid, inflated garment, sitting in one position, unable to reach any part of your own body above the neck ring. You are also more alone than the word usually means. There is one seat. On many of these missions, the radio is quiet for long stretches by design, and even when it is not, everything anybody can do for you is advice. Nobody can reach you. Nobody can look at you. If something goes wrong inside that suit, the nearest pair of hands is on the ground, hours away, and the entire remedy available consists of things you can do yourself with gloved fingers. Get used to that idea, because it is the thing that makes the ache at hour 6 a different problem from an ache anywhere else in life. You get hot. The suit is a closed environment with a person generating heat inside it, and the cooling is a system rather than a window. You get cold in the extremities at the same time because it is unbelievably cold outside and your hands are at the end of the longest run of everything. You eat, if you eat, by pushing a tube through a port and taking food as a paste. It is not a delicacy and nobody pretends otherwise. Drinking is the same arrangement, and it is the more important one because you are breathing dry gas for 12 hours, and dehydration up here is not a comfort problem, it is a performance problem, and you sit still. Not by choice. There is nowhere to shift to and no way to stretch anything properly. Ask anybody who has done a long, high flight what the worst part was, and it is very rarely the altitude and very often the specific misery of a pressure point on the back of a leg at hour 7. Everything the human body does casually all day, adjusting, rubbing an eye, changing how you are sitting, having a drink of water properly, blowing your nose, is either impossible or is a small procedure. 12 hours of that adds up in a way the hour count does not convey, and it is the reason this posting is considered demanding by people who fly other demanding things. And you get tired in the specific way that long, monotonous vigilance makes people tired, which is not sleepiness. It is a narrowing. You check the same 6 things on the same cycle, and after 5 hours, you catch yourself having checked one of them without registering what it said, and you go back and check it again. That is a well-documented effect with a name in the human factors literature, and it happens to everybody, and knowing it happens does not stop it happening. Then, somewhere around hour 6, your right shoulder starts to ache. Not badly. A dull, deep ache in the joint, the kind you would put down to sitting in one position for 6 hours in a stiff suit, which is exactly what you have been doing. It would be the obvious explanation, and it would probably be right. It is also exactly what the early stage of a nitrogen problem feels like. That is the situation you are in. You have a symptom with 2 completely different explanations, one trivial and one serious, and no way to distinguish between them. You cannot examine the joint. You cannot take the suit off. You cannot go down quickly because you are hours from anywhere and descending is not instant. What you can do is increase the pressure inside the suit, which is the standard response, and you can note it, and you can keep flying, and you can pay attention to whether it gets worse. So that is what you do for the next 3 hours. You fly the mission and you monitor your own shoulder. Now, the descent, and the thing every pilot says about this aircraft, coming down takes a long time, deliberately, because the same nitrogen physics applies in reverse, and there is no reason to rush a pressure change, and then you have to land it. And this aircraft is famously difficult to land, for reasons that have nothing to do with altitude. The descent itself is not a relief, it is a procedure. You came up through the pressure change slowly, and you go down through it slowly, because the nitrogen physics does not care which direction you are traveling, and a fast descent is its own decompression event in reverse. So it is managed in stages, with the cabin pressure and the suit pressure being brought back down in a controlled sequence, and it takes long enough that you have time to think about the shoulder. And then there is the aeroplane's own opinion about landing, which is strong. Those enormous wings that made 70,000 feet possible do not stop generating lift just because you would like them to. Close to the ground, the aircraft floats. It does not want to sit down. You have to fly it down onto the runway and then take the lift away from it at exactly the right height, and get that wrong by a few feet in either direction, and it either drops onto the wheels or refuses to come down at all. It is bicycle landing gear, one set of wheels forward, one set aft, and nothing at the wingtips. On the ground it needs small outrigger wheels fitted under the wings to stand up at all, and those drop away on takeoff. So on landing, the aircraft has to be flown down onto 2 sets of wheels in a line, wings level, at a very precise height, and then held there while the wings stop flying. And you cannot see properly. You are inside a helmet, in a suit, with restricted head movement, in an aircraft with a long nose, looking at a runway from an angle that does not give you the cues you need, so somebody else does that part for you. Another qualified pilot drives a car down the runway behind you, matching your speed, calling out your height above the surface in feet as you come down. That is a real, standard, permanent part of how this aircraft operates. 2 feet, 1 foot. Hold it. The landing is a two-person job in which one of the two is in a car. Wheels down, rolling out, outriggers refitted by the ground crew, and then the van again, and then the room, and then the team unlocking the helmet, and then air on your face for the first time in 12 hours. There is a specific physical state that comes with that moment, and it is not triumph. It is the state of a person who has been sitting still in a rigid garment for half a day, breathing dry gas, mildly dehydrated, with pressure marks on their body and a headache from the helmet and a set of muscles that have not been used properly since morning. Getting out is a process with help, and afterwards there is rest, because the exposure counts and nobody is expected to do this back to back. And the shoulder, which either fades over the next hours, and it was the seat, or it does not, and it was not. Here is the part that makes that ache more than a personal anecdote. Around the start of the last decade, medical researchers working with the Air Force went looking at the brains of pilots who had been flying these high-altitude missions repeatedly over years. They were looking for the cumulative effect of exactly the thing described above: routine, subclinical, day-after-day exposure to a pressure environment where nitrogen wants to come out of solution. What they reported was an increased incidence of small white matter lesions on brain imaging compared with controls. Not injuries anybody had noticed at the time. Not symptoms that had grounded anybody findings on a scan. In people who felt fine and were flying operationally, the response was engineering rather than medical. Raise the cockpit pressure so that the cabin altitude the pilot sits at is far lower than it had been. Extend the pre-breathe so more nitrogen is out before exposure begins. Change the exposure profile rather than treating the outcome. It is worth being precise about what that response means because it is unusual. The finding was not that anybody had been hurt in a way that stopped them flying. The finding was a statistical difference on a scan, and the reaction to a statistical difference on a scan was to spend money changing the pressurization of an operational aircraft fleet and to lengthen a procedure that every pilot already found tedious. That is a system deciding that a signal it could barely detect was worth acting on, which is close to the opposite of how most industries respond to marginal evidence. And that reframes everything about the flight you just did. The suit was never protecting you against a single dramatic failure, a canopy loss, or an explosive decompression, although it does that too. The suit was there because the environment was applying continuous physiological stress for 12 hours, every mission, for years, at a level low enough that nobody felt it happening. Which is the real answer to what the danger was today. Not the Coffin Corner, although it is real and it is narrow. Not the landing, although it is hard enough to need a man in a car. It was a slow, subclinical process taking place inside a person who could not examine himself, could not remove his equipment, could not descend quickly, and had no way to tell an ordinary ache from an early warning. The most sophisticated component in that entire system is the one that had to sit there for 3 hours wondering. So, an hour in a chair breathing pure oxygen to wash the nitrogen out, because above 62,000 feet, the pressure is too low to keep water a liquid at body temperature, and a mask cannot fix an absence of pressure. 9 hours in a rigid, inflated pressure vessel shaped like a person, flying an aircraft inside a speed band a few knots wide, unable to touch your own face. A landing that takes 2 qualified pilots, one of them in a car, and a symptom you could not diagnose which turned out to describe something real enough that the aircraft's cockpit pressure was changed because of it. The next time you see one of these on a runway, the enormous thin wings, the black paint, the ground crew swarming it, the man being helped out of it in a suit that looks like it belongs on the moon, understand what the suit is actually for. Not the drama, not one catastrophic moment. 12 hours of an environment quietly working on somebody, and a garment that is the only thing standing between an ordinary Tuesday and physics. If that changed how you think about a machine you have only seen in photographs, subscribe. Next time, 24 hours, 90 feet underground behind a door that has no handle on the outside, where 2 people share one bunk and the most important instrument in the building is a handwritten column of numbers. And tell me in the comments which one you would take. 12 hours in the suit, or 24 hours in the capsule. This video is for educational purposes only. It draws on published engineering literature, declassified documentation, manufacturer and service publications, and peer-reviewed medical research. Where a figure is an outside estimate or has never been released, this is stated, and where practice varies between services or over time, this is noted. Nothing in this video is operational guidance.